They called her invisible, they called her nothing. They handed her a mop and looked through her like she was made of air. But the man watching from the shadows in a delivery uniform saw everything. He saw the way she smiled despite the cruelty. He saw the way she held her head high when they tried to break her. And in that moment, something ancient and unstoppable cracked open inside his chest. He had built empires. He had commanded silence with a single glance. But one woman, mopping a floor she never dirtied, brought the most feared man in Korea to his knees. "It's nice having you here. Please like, share, subscribe and tell me why you clicked this video." Her name was Blessing. Blessing Adiz Okafor, 28 years old, originally from Lagos, now surviving in the glittering, unforgiving city of Seoul. She had come here on a scholarship that evaporated after her second year when the funding dried up and the university simply shrugged. She had stayed because going back felt like admitting defeat, and Blessing had never learned how to do that gracefully. She cleaned the Hansung Grand Hotel from 5 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon, 6 days a week. And she did it with a kind of quiet dignity that made certain women on the staff deeply uncomfortable. Those women had names too. Mrs. O was the head of housekeeping, a sharp-tongued woman with immaculate hair who had decided on Blessing's first day that she did not like the look of her. Then there was Jainar, the assistant supervisor, who followed Mrs. O like a shadow and laughed at everything she said, especially when it was directed at Blessing. And finally there was Suyun, a junior staff member who was simply mean in the way that some people are mean, reflexively, without reason, as though cruelty was their native language. They hid her cleaning supplies. They gave her the heaviest cart. They assigned her the most difficult floors without explanation and then reported her when she finished late. Once, Jainar poured an entire bucket of dirty water across a section Blessing had just finished and stood there watching with a smile as Blessing knelt to clean it again without a word. Blessing did not cry at work. She had made herself that promise on the first day. She saved the crying for the small apartment she shared with her friend Chisholm, where she would sit on the edge of her bed after a long shift and let herself feel everything for exactly 10 minutes before pulling herself back together, eating whatever she had managed to afford that week, and going to sleep so she could get up and do it all again. She was not unhappy in the way that breaks people. She was unhappy in the way that quietly builds character, and there was a difference, though it was hard to feel that difference at 5 in the morning when she was hauling a cart twice her size down a corridor while Mrs. O called after her to move faster. What Blessing did not know, could not have known, was that the Hansung Grand Hotel was not simply a hotel. It belonged, through a very careful arrangement of shell companies and legitimate investments, to the Kang family organization. And the Kang family organization was run by a man named Kang Min-ho, 34 years old, who had taken over his father's empire at 26 and turned it into something so formidable and so meticulously structured that even law enforcement spoke his name with a kind of reluctant respect. He was not the kind of man who appeared in newspapers. He was the kind of man newspapers avoided writing about, not out of laziness, but out of something closer to wisdom. He was tall in the way that fills a doorway, dark-haired, with sharp eyes that missed nothing and a jaw that looked like it had been designed specifically to make people feel intimidated. He smiled rarely, and when he did, the people around him felt the peculiar sensation of being both relieved and more nervous than before. His inner circle described him in 2 words: precise and relentless. He arrived at the Hansung Grand on a Tuesday morning in a delivery uniform. This was not unusual for Kang Min-ho. Once a month, sometimes more, he conducted what he privately called inspections, moving through his properties in disguise, watching how his businesses actually operated when they believed he was not watching. He had discovered embezzlement this way. He had discovered incompetent managers and excellent ones. He had once overheard a junior accountant explaining a loophole in their tax arrangement to another employee, and had that accountant promoted within the week, because the man was clearly too smart to be wasted in a junior role. He arrived on the service level with a dolly and 3 boxes, and spent the first hour simply moving through the hotel, watching and listening. He was on the 14th floor when he heard it. A voice, not loud, not dramatic, just firm and steady in the way of someone who has learned to hold on to their dignity with both hands in situations where other people are trying to pull it away. He stopped outside a linen closet. Inside, Mrs. O was speaking in that particular tone she reserved for staff she had decided to enjoy tormenting. Beside her, Jinar was adding commentary. And in front of them, a young woman in a housekeeping uniform was holding a mop handle with both hands, not like a weapon, but like something to hold on to while the storm passed over her. Blessing was not looking at the floor. That was the first thing Minho noticed. Every instinct she must have had was probably telling her to look down, to make herself smaller, to weather it and let it pass. But she was looking directly at Mrs. O with an expression that was perfectly composed and somehow, under all that composure, burning. Mrs. O was telling her that her work was insufficient, that she had missed a spot, that frankly, the hotel had standards that certain employees simply could not seem to meet. Jinar laughed at something. Suyun, standing in the doorway, had her phone out. And Blessing said, quietly and with perfect clarity, that she had not missed any spot, that her work was documented in the check sheet that Mrs. O was holding, and that if there was a specific concern, she would be glad to address it in writing through the proper HR channel. Mrs. O's expression changed in the way of someone who has been handled more gracefully than they expected. Minho stood very still in the corridor. Something happened to him in that moment that he would spend the next several weeks trying to understand and eventually stop trying to understand and simply accept. It was not attraction, though that was certainly present, arriving without permission and with considerable force. It was something else, something older, like recognition, like finding a word in a language you did not know you spoke. He walked away before anyone saw him. But he did not forget what he had seen. The following morning, Minho sat in the office above the hotel, the one that officially belonged to the hotel's general manager, but was, in practice, his. He had pulled the employee files. He had read Blessing's performance reviews, which were uniformly excellent when graded by the objective metrics and uniformly undermined in the comment sections by whoever had written them. He had read the HR complaint she had filed 3 weeks ago about the bucket incident, which had been marked as resolved with no visible resolution. He had read her attendance record, which was perfect, her punctuality record, which was better than perfect. He called his general manager, a man named Director Yoon, and had a conversation that lasted 4 minutes. By the end of it, Director Yoon understood, without Minho using a single threatening word, that certain adjustments needed to be made to the housekeeping department. Minho did not tell Blessing any of this. He was not yet sure why. He went back downstairs in the delivery uniform. He told himself he was continuing the inspection. He found Blessing on the 9th floor, moving with that efficient, unhurried rhythm that he had noticed the day before, the kind of rhythm that belongs to people who have learned to pace themselves over long distances. She had earphones in one ear, the other ear free, and he could hear faintly that she was listening to something that made her mouth curve occasionally into a small private smile that she was not sharing with the corridor. He walked past her twice before he manufactured a reason to stop. He pretended his dolly wheel had jammed near the supply room she was heading toward. He crouched down, making a show of examining it, and when Blessing arrived and found a delivery man blocking the supply room entrance, looking baffled by a perfectly functional wheel, she tilted her head and said, with a directness that startled him, that the left wheel on that model always stuck when the floor was freshly polished, and she could show him the trick to it if he wanted. He said, looking up at her, that he would very much appreciate that. She showed him. Her hands were quick and certain. She clearly had no idea she was crouching beside the man who owned the building she was standing in. She was simply helping a delivery man with a stuck wheel because that was the kind of person she was. She straightened, and their eyes met, and Minho had the experience, genuinely unfamiliar to him, of not immediately knowing what to say next. He told her his name was Kim. She told him her name was Blessing, and that it was a Nigerian name, and that yes, it meant exactly what it sounded like. He asked her how long she had worked at the hotel. She said long enough. She said it with a smile that contained several layers of meaning, and he understood all of them. She went back to work. He stood there for a moment holding a dolly before he remembered he was supposed to be pushing it. Over the next 2 weeks, Min-ho found reasons to be on whichever floor Blessing was working. He told himself a great many things about why he was doing this. He was ensuring the quality of his inspection. He was monitoring the improvement of the housekeeping situation. He was conducting a thorough assessment of the 9th through 14th floors, which happened to be Blessing's regular rotation. None of these explanations were entirely untrue. All of them were insufficient. What was true was that something about Blessing Okafor had burrowed into him in a way he could not dislodge, and he had stopped trying to. He watched her move through the world with a kind of grace that had nothing to do with ease and everything to do with choice. He watched her handle small indignities with a composure that he recognized as strength, not passivity. He watched her laugh with the kitchen porter named Daniel, who was the only person on staff who seemed to be genuinely kind to her, and he felt something complicated and warm at the sight of her laughing, and something considerably less warm at the sight of Daniel making her laugh. He brought her coffee twice, both times under the pretense of delivering supplies to the floor. The first time she looked surprised and slightly suspicious. The second time she accepted it with a look that said she had decided to let herself have this small thing even if she did not fully understand it, and the warmth of that particular look stayed with him for days. It was on a Thursday afternoon, 2.5 weeks into his new and completely uncharacteristic routine, that things shifted. He arrived on the 11th floor to find Blessing at the end of the corridor, not working, but standing very still with her back against the wall and her arms folded across her chest, in the posture of someone who is keeping themselves composed through considerable effort. Mrs. O was a few feet away. Between them, on the floor, was a tray of cleaning supplies that had been knocked over, and the pattern of the spill suggested it had not been knocked over by accident. Jaina was laughing. Soo-yoon had her phone out again. Min-ho stopped at the end of the corridor. He was still in the delivery uniform. No one noticed him. Mrs. O was telling Blessing, in that particular smooth tone of someone who knows they have the institutional power in a situation, that accidents happen, but that Blessing really should be more careful, because this kind of carelessness had been noted several times now, and it was becoming something of a pattern. She was saying this about a spill she had clearly caused herself. Blessing looked at the spill. She looked at Mrs. O. She said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, carefully and precisely, that she would clean it up, that she would also be documenting this incident with a timestamp and photographs, as she had been advised to do by HR following her last report, and that she wanted to note for the record that 3 other staff members were present to witness the circumstances. Mrs. O's smile tightened. Min-ho turned around and walked to the elevator. He called Director Yoon before the doors had finished closing. The conversation this time lasted 6 minutes. When he finished the call, he stood in the elevator, looking at his own reflection in the polished steel, and had a very honest conversation with himself about what exactly he was doing. He was protecting her. That was plain enough. What was more complicated, what required him to stand in an elevator for 2 floors longer than necessary, was why it felt like the most important thing he had done in recent memory. The following Monday, Mrs. O received a transfer notice to the hotel's smaller property across the city, effective immediately, citing a restructuring of management in housekeeping. Jaina was assigned to a role that involved significantly less authority and significantly more actual cleaning. Soo-yoon received a formal written warning regarding the use of personal devices during working hours. Director Yoon delivered these notices personally. Blessing arrived for her shift that Monday morning to find that her cart had been replaced with a newer model, that her floor rotation had been adjusted to include only the floors she handled most efficiently, that there was a note in her file, authored by someone in upper management whose name she did not recognize, commending her performance and her documentation practices. She stood reading that note for a long moment. She did not know who had done this. She had learned enough about how institutions work to know that things did not simply get better on their own, that someone had moved something on her behalf. She was grateful and unsettled by it in equal measure, because Blessing Okafor had learned the hard way that things given could be taken back, and she preferred to earn what she kept. She went to her shift. She did her work. She was, without Mrs. O's interference, extraordinarily good at it. On her break, she sat in the small staff room on the basement level, eating the jollof rice she had made that morning because it was cheaper and better than anything the hotel cafeteria offered, when the door opened and a man in a delivery uniform leaned in, looked at her food, and said that it smelled incredible. She said it should, since she had been perfecting that recipe for approximately 10 years. He said he had not eaten since morning. He said it in a way that was not exactly asking and not quite stating. She looked at him for a long moment. She had eaten with him twice before in the informal way of people who happened to be in the same corridor at the same time. She had not thought much of it. She was thinking considerably more of it now, sitting in the staff room, watching him look at her jollof rice, with an expression she was almost certain she had never seen on a man's face before, at least not directed at her. She slid the container toward him and handed him a spoon from her bag. He sat across from her. He ate with the concentration of someone who was genuinely tasting every element, and then he said that it was the best thing he had eaten in at least 3 years, and he said it with such certainty that she laughed. She asked him what he was delivering that kept bringing him to this specific hotel so many days in a row. He said it was a long-term contract with a demanding client. She said the client must be very particular. He said the client was the most particular person he had ever met. She said that sounded exhausting. He said, looking directly at her, that it had recently started to feel considerably less exhausting than it used to. She looked away first. Later, alone in her apartment, she told Chisholm about the delivery man. Chisholm, who had excellent instincts about most things, said immediately that something sounded different in Blessing's voice when she talked about him. Blessing said that was because she was tired and her voice did odd things when she was tired. Chisholm said that was not what odd things your voice did when you were tired, and that Blessing should be careful, but also should absolutely not shut this down before it started. Blessing lay awake thinking about the way he had looked at her across that small table in the staff room, like she was the most interesting thing he had seen in a very long time, and she felt something she had not felt in years unfurl cautiously in her chest. She pressed it back down. Then she let it unfurl again, just a little, just enough to remind herself it was still there. His real name was Kang Min-ho. She did not know this yet. A few days later, Blessing encountered someone new on her rotation. His name, according to everyone who mentioned him, was Cha Jun-ho. He was the new beverage manager for the hotel's rooftop bar, and he had apparently decided, within 48 hours of his arrival, that Blessing was someone he wanted to know better. He had a wide, easy smile and the kind of effortless charm that she recognized as something that had worked for him many times before. He appeared on her floor twice with no particular reason. He brought her a coffee from the rooftop espresso machine and made a point of mentioning that it was the expensive kind. Blessing was polite. She was also, in the private corners of her own mind, fairly unimpressed. She had known men like Cha Jun-ho, men who moved through the world with the confidence of people who had never been told no and who were interested in her specifically because she had not yet responded to the smile. What she did not know was that the delivery man named Kim had, on that particular afternoon, arrived on her floor to find Cha Jun-ho leaning against the wall beside her cart, saying something that made her smile politely but not warmly, and that the delivery man named Kim had stood at the end of that corridor for a full 20 seconds doing absolutely nothing with his face, except controlling it with a degree of effort that would have alarmed anyone who knew him well. Min-ho turned around and walked back to the elevator. He went to his office. He sat down. He looked at the wall for a period of time he did not measure. Then he looked up Cha Jun-ho in the employee system, read his file in approximately 3 minutes, found nothing particularly objectionable in it, closed the file, and spent the next hour in a state of mind he did not entirely recognize. He eventually admitted to himself, jealous. This was an experience so foreign to him that he spent some time simply sitting with it, the way you might sit with a piece of furniture that has been moved without your permission and that you are not yet sure how to move back. He was jealous of a beverage manager. He was jealous because a beverage manager had made Blessing smile in a corridor of a hotel. He was jealous because he himself had been making her smile in corridors of this hotel for nearly 3 weeks, and he had not told her his real name or his real position or the fact that the building she worked in technically belonged to him. He needed to tell her. He was not yet ready to tell her. The moment he told her, everything would change, and he was not sure what it would change into. And for the first time in many years, Kang Min-ho was in a situation where he could not precisely predict the outcome and found he cared enormously about getting it right. The following Wednesday, he brought her lunch. Not coffee, lunch. A container from the Korean restaurant 3 streets away that he had eaten at twice and thought she might like. He arrived on her floor during her break time and found her in the small courtyard access space off the 9th floor, sitting on a low ledge looking out at the city with her face tipped slightly upward and her eyes almost closed. She heard him coming and opened her eyes and looked at the container in his hand, and something shifted in her expression, something she tucked away quickly. She asked him what he was doing. He said he thought she might not have had time for a proper lunch today. She said she always made time for lunch and held up her own container, which was considerably smaller than his. He sat down beside her, which was not something he had done before, not this close, not in this particular way that felt distinctly less like 2 people who happened to be in the same corridor and distinctly more like a choice. She looked at the container he had brought. She said she could not take his lunch. He said it was not his lunch, that he had bought it specifically for her, and he said it in a tone that made it impossible to pass off as casual. She was very still for a moment. Then she said, quietly, "Why?" He looked at her. The sunlight was coming through the window at an angle that made her skin look luminous and her eyes darker and more complex than usual. And he thought about all the careful explanations he had been preparing, all the logical frameworks he had constructed for what he was doing and why. And he said, simply and honestly, that he had not been able to stop thinking about her since the first day he saw her. The city below them made its ordinary noise. A bus somewhere, someone's phone, the distant ordinary rhythm of Seoul. Blessing looked at the container in his hands. She looked at him. She took the container. She did not say anything else for a moment. Then she said that she did not know very much about him, except that he was a delivery man named Kim, who was apparently assigned to this hotel indefinitely and who had very strong feelings about jollof rice. He said those were all accurate facts about him. He said there were also other facts. She said she was listening. He opened his mouth, and then his phone rang, the private line, the one that only 4 people had the number to, and the expression on his face when he saw the name on the screen was enough that Blessing said immediately, "Go ahead, answer it." He stepped away. The call was brief. When he came back, something had changed in the set of his shoulders. He said he was sorry, that he had to go, that there was something he needed to handle. She said, of course. He said he would explain everything soon, and he said it with an intensity that made her still. She watched him leave. She ate the lunch he had brought. It was excellent. She sat there in the courtyard access space for the remaining minutes of her break and felt that thing in her chest unfurling again, further this time, and she did not press it back down. That evening, Min-ho dealt with what needed to be dealt with, a dispute between 2 business interests that had been building for weeks and that required his presence and his particular brand of resolution, which was calm and absolute and left no room for misinterpretation. By midnight it was finished. He sat in his car outside his own building and thought about the courtyard on the 9th floor and the way Blessing had looked when he said he had not been able to stop thinking about her. He thought about telling her the truth. He was going to tell her the truth. The question was how to do it in a way that did not make her feel deceived, because the last thing he wanted was for her to feel that she had been observed from a position of power without her knowledge, which was precisely what had happened, and which he was going to have to find a very careful way of addressing. He went to sleep. He dreamed, unusually for him, and in the morning he could not remember what about except that it had been warm. 3 days later, Blessing arrived at work to find that the small lockers in the staff changing room had been reorganized and that hers now had a key that actually worked instead of the bent one she had been fighting with for 4 months. There was no note. There was no explanation. She stood looking at the locker for a moment, and then she shook her head and smiled and put her things away. Chisholm, when she told her that evening, said that the key situation, along with the lunch and the coffee, and the fact that this man had been appearing on her floor for nearly a month, was beginning to sound less like coincidence and more like a campaign. Blessing said that was a very dramatic way to describe a man who fixed a locker key. Chisholm said she was describing it accurately and that Blessing should perhaps consider that someone was working very hard to show her he cared, without being sure yet how she felt about it, and that there was something quite wonderful about that if she let herself see it. Blessing thought about this for longer than she intended to. The following Friday, the hotel held its quarterly appreciation event for staff, a relatively modest affair in the lower conference room with food and a brief speech from Director Yoon. Blessing attended because attendance was noted and because the food was genuinely good. She wore the blue dress she saved for occasions because she believed in showing up with care even when the occasion did not strictly require it. She was talking with Daniel, the kitchen porter, and 2 of the other housekeeping staff she had become friendly with since Mrs. O's departure, when she became aware that someone had entered the conference room and that the atmosphere in the room had shifted in the way it does when a person with significant gravity enters a space. She turned to look, following the direction of everyone else's eyes. And she saw the delivery man named Kim. Except he was not in a delivery uniform. He was in a dark charcoal suit that fit him in the way that suits fit men who have them made specifically for them, and he was moving through the room with Director Yoon at his shoulder, speaking with the ease of someone who was comfortable being the most significant person present, and everyone around him was behaving in the precise way that people behave around someone they either answer to or hope to impress. Blessing stood very still. She watched Director Yoon gesture toward him with both hands and heard the words she caught above the noise of the room. The owner, welcome, honored, and her mind performed a rapid and unpleasant recalculation. The delivery man named Kim was not a delivery man. The delivery man named Kim was the person who owned this building. She looked at him across the conference room and found that he was already looking at her. His expression was careful and also, underneath the care, something that looked very much like the expression of a man who knows he is about to face a consequence he has earned and is not running from it. Blessing turned and walked out of the conference room. She got her coat from the locker with the key that now worked. She put it on. She walked to the elevator with the deliberate, even pace of someone who is not running but is also not stopping. She pressed the button for the lobby. The elevator doors opened, and she walked out and through the lobby and through the glass doors into the cold of the Seoul evening. She stood on the pavement and breathed. He had known from the beginning who he was and what this place was, and she had known nothing. She had shown him her jollof rice and told him her name meant exactly what it sounded like and talked to him about her break times and her locker key and sat with him in the courtyard on the 9th floor, and he had looked at her like she was something extraordinary, and all of it had been what exactly? She did not know. That was the part that made her chest tight. She did not know what it had been. She started walking. She heard her name, not Kim, not the delivery man. A different voice, the same voice, saying her name with an urgency that was not performed. She did not stop. He caught up to her at the corner because his legs were longer and he had clearly moved fast. He stepped around her and put himself in front of her without touching her and said, "Blessing, please." She stopped because he was in the way and because the please had sounded like something pulled from a place he did not usually access. She looked at him. He was not wearing his jacket. He had come out into the cold Seoul evening in his suit without his jacket to catch up to her at a street corner. She said, slowly and clearly, that she would like to know who he actually was. He told her his real name, what he did, what the hotel was. He told her all of it in the direct, unhedged way she had noticed he used when he had decided something was important enough to not manage carefully. He told her he had come to the hotel on an inspection and found her and had not been able to make himself leave properly since. He told her the things he had arranged, the transfer, the new cart, the locker key, and he told her he understood that this might feel like an intrusion and that she had every right to be angry. She listened to all of it. Then she said that what she needed right now was to think, and that she needed to do that without him standing in front of her at a street corner in the cold without his jacket. She said he should go back inside before he froze. He said he would stand here as long as she needed. She looked at him for a long moment. She said goodnight, Kang Min-ho. She said his real name. She watched something move through his expression at the sound of it. She walked to the bus stop and got on the next bus and sat by the window and let the city move past her in the dark. In her apartment, Chisholm took one look at her face and said nothing and made tea. Blessing sat with the tea for a long time. She thought about everything she knew about him, the things she had seen before she knew who he was, the way he listened, the way he had said she was the best thing he had eaten in 3 years, the coffee, the lunch, the locker key, the look on his face in the conference room when he found her looking at him and did not look away. She thought about the fact that a man who could have done anything had spent a month learning which floor she was working on and bringing her coffee. She thought about Chisholm's theory about campaigns. She thought about her own heart, which was being considerably less guarded than she was instructing it to be. She said to Chisholm, who was sitting quietly across from her, that she did not know what to do. Chisholm said that was fine. She said Blessing did not have to know what to do tonight. She said that knowing what she felt was a good place to start. Blessing considered this. She knew what she felt. She went to sleep. Min-ho, on the other side of the city, did not sleep easily. He sat in his apartment, which was large and quiet and full of beautiful things he had acquired without much feeling, and which felt tonight specifically like the set of a life rather than a life, and he looked at his phone for a long time before putting it face down on the table. He did not text her. She had said she needed to think, and he had learned, in the 34 years of his life, that the most important thing you could do for someone who needed to think was give them space to do it. He was not good at waiting. He had structured his entire professional existence around not having to wait. But he found, sitting in his quiet apartment with its beautiful things, that he was willing to wait for this. He was, if he was honest with himself, willing to wait for quite a long time. Monday morning, Blessing went to work. She arrived at her usual time, changed into her uniform, collected her cart, and went to her floor. She was on the 11th level, which was higher than her usual rotation, and she registered this without reacting to it. She worked for 2 hours without encountering anyone significant. At 10:15, the elevator at the end of her corridor opened, and Kang Min-ho stepped out, this time in his actual clothes, a dark coat over a dark shirt, carrying 2 coffees. He walked to where she was, stopped at a respectful distance, and held out one of the coffees without saying anything. She looked at the coffee, she looked at him. She took the coffee. She said, looking straight ahead down the corridor rather than at him, that she had decided she appreciated honesty more than comfort, and that if they were going to have any kind of anything, he needed to commit to telling her the truth, even when the truth was inconvenient. He said that was something he could absolutely do. She said she also needed him to understand that she was not going to be managed. She was not a situation to be handled or a problem to be organized. She was a person, and she made her own choices. He said he understood that, and then he said, with a quietness that she felt more than heard, that her choices were the thing he respected most about her, and that he would never try to take them from her. She drank her coffee. She said that this whole thing was very strange. He said he was aware of that. She said she was going to keep working now because she was on the clock. He said he would walk with her if she did not mind. She said she did not mind. And so they moved together down the 11th floor corridor, one of them pushing a cart, the other drinking his coffee, and they talked the way people talk when they are beginning to let down the last layer of caution, carefully and then less carefully, with long pauses and then without them. He told her about his father. She told him about leaving Lagos. He told her about the first property his family had bought and the feeling of standing in an empty building knowing you were responsible for making it into something. She told him about the scholarship and the way it felt when it dissolved, like the ground moving, and the decision to stay anyway because the alternative felt like retreating from her own life. He listened to her the way he listened to everything completely, without the performance of listening. She pushed the cart, and he walked beside her, and the 11th floor corridor felt, for no logical reason, like a space they had been sharing for years. By the end of that week, Kang Min-ho had told 4 people in his inner circle that there was someone he was seeing. His second in command, a man named Sung-woo who had worked with him for 8 years, asked no questions but arranged his schedule with a slightly different priority structure going forward. His aunt, who was the only family member whose opinion he weighted, said that he sounded different on the phone and asked if everything was all right. He said yes, and she said good, and then there was a pause in which she clearly wanted to ask more and chose not to, which was one of the many reasons he was fond of her. He did not see Cha Jun-ho again on Blessing's floor. This was not entirely coincidental. A few days later, Min-ho took her to dinner. Not to the hotel restaurant, somewhere smaller in the kind of neighborhood that does not appear in magazines. A Korean restaurant with 4 tables and a proprietor who had been cooking the same menu for 30 years and needed no innovation because perfection did not require improving. Min-ho had been coming here since he was 22, and the proprietor, a woman who was small and direct and called everyone by the wrong name intentionally, referred to him as her most difficult regular and put an extra portion of something into whatever he ordered. Blessing walked in and looked at the 4 tables and the handwritten menu on the wall and the proprietor who pointed at their table and said, "You sit," and she said to Min-ho that she liked it here immediately. He felt something in his chest that he recognized, after a moment, as happiness, which was not an emotion he had spent much time identifying in his own experience recently. They ate for 2 hours. She told him about her mother in Lagos, who called every Sunday and who had been told that Blessing was working in hospitality management because explaining the specifics to a Nigerian mother who had wanted a doctor or a lawyer was an ongoing project. He laughed at this, actually laughed, not the controlled kind but the spontaneous kind, and the proprietor looked over at the sound with an expression of considerable surprise. She asked him what made him laugh like that, and he said he was not entirely sure, that it had been a while since something had done that without effort. She looked at him across the table with an expression he was learning to read, one that meant she was filing something away. She asked him what his world was actually like, not the official version, the real one, what it cost. He told her, not the details that would frighten her unnecessarily, but the weight of it, the way it felt to make decisions where the outcomes affected many people, the loneliness of the position, the way trust became a resource you managed carefully because it was finite, and the consequences of misplacing it were significant. She listened without offering solutions, which was exactly right, because the situation did not need solutions, it needed someone to sit with it honestly. He said afterward that he had not talked about any of that with anyone in a very long time. She said she was glad he had told her. She said it like she meant it, which she did. Walking back to the car afterward, in the cool evening, she slipped slightly on a damp piece of pavement, and his hand was there before she had finished the first syllable of reacting, steady and warm at her elbow, and he kept it there after she had regained her footing, and she let him, and they walked the rest of the way like that, without discussing it. In the car, heading back, she looked out the window at Seoul passing in the dark, and thought about how strange it was that the city looked the same as it always had, and she felt entirely different inside it. She was falling, She knew she was falling. She was doing it with her eyes open, which was the only way she knew how to fall, and she was frightened by it in the specific way you are frightened by things you want badly. The following Tuesday brought a complication. It arrived in the form of a woman named Director Park, who represented a business consortium that had been attempting to acquire a portion of Minho's hotel properties for over a year. She arrived at the Hansung Grand for what was supposed to be a preliminary meeting with Director Yoon, but which, Sung-woo informed Minho privately, was actually a reconnaissance, an attempt to assess Minho's current position and any potential pressure points. Minho attended the meeting. It was routine. Director Park was sharp and professional and not particularly successful at concealing that she was also testing boundaries. The complication was not Director Park. The complication was that Director Park had brought with her a man named Kim Hyun-yi, who was described as a consultant, but who was, Minho knew from his own intelligence, a specialist in finding the personal vulnerabilities of business adversaries and leveraging them. Within 48 hours of the meeting, Kim Hyun-yi had identified Blessing. Not directly, not in any way that was immediately visible, but Minho's information network was thorough, and what came back to him was that someone had been asking careful questions about staff at the Hansung Grand, about particular staff members who seemed to have a different kind of relationship with hotel management, and that the questions had a shape and a direction that Minho did not like. He told Blessing that evening, at the small restaurant, choosing honesty over the impulse to manage the situation without troubling her. She listened, she did not panic, which was one of the things about her that continued to undo him. She sat with the information for a moment and then said, practically, what did this mean and what did he need her to do? He said what it meant was that he was going to need to be more visible in his association with her, which would either deter or escalate depending on how Director Park calculated her position. He said what it meant in personal terms was that he wanted her to know that he was not going to step back from them, because of professional pressure, and he said it with an emphasis that was not about the business context at all. She looked at him for a long time. She said carefully that she needed to understand something. She said she was a hotel cleaning staff member from Lagos with a locker key and a jollof rice recipe, and he was whatever he actually was, and she needed to know that this, what was developing between them, was not something that was going to be set aside when it became inconvenient for him. He said, looking at her directly in the way he had, that he had set aside convenient things his entire life and had never once set aside the important ones, and that he needed her to understand clearly which category she was in. She felt the words arrive somewhere in her chest and settle there. She said she was not sure she was ready to think about what that meant yet. He said that was all right. He said he was not going anywhere. The situation with Kim Hyun-yi resolved itself inside a week, not through drama, but through the kind of quiet strategic pressure that Minho exercised in the way other men exercise muscles, naturally and without fanfare. Director Park's consortium withdrew its interest. Kim Hyun-yi moved on to other projects. The inquiry into hotel staff stopped. But the week had shaken something loose in Blessing. It had made real, in a way that a month of corridor coffees and dinners had not quite done, the nature of the world she was adjacent to now, not inside yet, not committed to, but adjacent, and she could feel the weight of the choice ahead of her. She went quiet for 3 days, not hostile, not gone, simply pulled inward the way she did when she was working something out. Minho noticed, of course he noticed. He had been paying attention to her for nearly 2 months with a completeness that was foreign to him and that he had stopped questioning. He gave her the space. He did not appear on her floor. He sent her a message, a single line that said he was there when she was ready, and then he put his phone down and went to work. On the 3rd day, she texted him. She said, "Are you free tonight?" He cleared his evening in approximately 4 minutes. She chose the restaurant. It was a Nigerian place in Itaewon that she had been to twice since arriving in Seoul, and that felt, she said when they arrived, like a small piece of something she missed. The music was right, and the jollof rice, she noted with professional assessment, was not as good as hers, but was perfectly creditable. He agreed because he had developed an opinion on this subject. They ate and talked, and at some point during the conversation she said, looking at her plate, that she had been thinking about the difference between her life before she met him and her life now, and that the difference was not about the locker key or the lunch or any of the specific things he had done. The difference was that she had spent 4 years in Seoul being genuinely invisible to people who looked directly at her, and then she had met him, and he had looked at her like she was the only thing in the room worth looking at, and she had not realized until now how long she had been living without that. She was still looking at her plate. He said her name. She looked up. He said that he saw her. He said he had seen her from the first day in that corridor, and he had not been able to look away since. He said he was not asking her to trust his world or to fit herself into his life or to be anything other than exactly who she was. He was asking if she would let him stand next to her, whatever that looked like. Outside in Itaewon, the street was busy and lit and full of its own noise. Inside, it was just them and the rightness of the moment. She said yes. She said it simply, without performance, the way she said the things she meant. He reached across the table and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat like that for a long time while Seoul moved around them. The weeks that followed had a warmth and a shape to them that Blessing had not expected. She had expected intensity, which was present. She had expected complication, which was also present. She had not expected the quietness of it, the way being with Min-ho felt less like entering a storm and more like finding the still center of one. He learned her schedule the way he had always known it, but now openly, without pretense. He appeared on Thursday evenings when her shift finished and took her to eat somewhere she had not been. He called her on Sunday mornings, which became a ritual, her sitting with tea while he sat with coffee, and they talked about the week, about things that mattered and things that did not, about her mother's Sunday phone calls and the latest thing that had made her laugh and the details of his work that he could share and the shape of the things he could not share, but that she was learning to read in the pauses. She met Sungwoo, who was formal with her in the way of someone who is protective of the person they are being formal around, and who relaxed over the course of a single dinner, to the point of telling her a mildly embarrassing story about Min-ho at a formal event 5 years ago that Min-ho received with the dignity of a man who has accepted that certain stories exist and will be told. She met his aunt, who looked at her for a long time and then said that she had good eyes and offered her food immediately, which Min-ho explained in the car afterward was the highest possible form of approval in his family. She said she would take it. He said she should, that it was sincerely meant. The Tuesday of the third week was when Daniel, the kitchen porter who had been kind to her from the beginning, mentioned to her on his lunch break that there was something going around on the staff messaging app, that someone had posted something. He looked uncomfortable. He showed her his phone. It was anonymous. It said that the housekeeping staff member who had thought she was too good for her job had found a faster way up, that management was not management in the traditional sense, that certain people who could not keep a locker key working for 4 months had apparently managed to fix that particular problem. It was not signed. It did not need to be. Blessing read it once. She looked at Daniel's phone, and she thought about how long it had taken her to feel comfortable in this building, and she thought about the particular tiredness of being talked about, and she felt the specific burn of it, not in her eyes, but somewhere below that, in the chest, in the place where you keep the things you are still working through. She said thank you to Daniel for telling her. She went back to work. She told Min-ho that evening. She told him factually, without drama, because she was not someone who dramatized her pain, but she told him because she had decided honesty went in both directions. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, carefully, that he wanted to handle this and that he needed her to tell him how she wanted it handled, because he had learned that she did not want to be managed, and so he was asking. She said she wanted it taken down, and she wanted it addressed through the proper HR process, not through whatever alternate methods he might have available to him in his professional capacity as the person who owned the building. She said she needed it to be clean and institutional and documented. He said he understood. He said he would have it addressed that way. He also said, looking at her, that he wanted to say something that had nothing to do with the handling of the situation. He said that anyone who reduced what she was and what she had built to a rumor about who she was adjacent to had fundamentally failed to understand her, and that her value was so legible and so evident to anyone who had spent more than 10 minutes in her presence, that the rumor said nothing about her and everything about the person who had written it. She looked at him. She said he could not just say things like that. He said, why not, if they were true? She looked away. She looked back. She said that she was going to need him to understand that she was not accustomed to this, to someone who said what they meant and meant what they said, and that she was learning it, but it was not a fast process. He said he was not in any hurry. The rumor was taken down by the next morning through an HR process that was swift and thorough. There was a formal inquiry. Several things became clear in the course of it, including the origin of the post, which was not Mrs. O, who was across the city, but someone who had been emboldened by the previous culture and had not understood that the culture had changed. That person received consequences proportionate to the offense, institutional and documented, exactly as Blessing had asked. Sung-woo told Min-ho privately that the staff at the Hansung Grand had shifted considerably in tone over the past 2 months, and that the quarterly satisfaction metrics were the highest they had been in 4 years. Min-ho filed this information without comment. He had not made these changes for the metrics. 6 weeks after the corridor on the 9th floor, autumn had fully arrived in Seoul. The streets were the color of the things you love most about seasons changing. Min-ho took Blessing to a gallery opening on a Saturday, not for any strategic reason, but simply because he had seen the exhibition advertised and thought she would find it interesting. She wore a deep red dress she had never had occasion to wear before and stood in front of a particular piece for nearly 10 minutes without speaking, which the artist, who was present, noticed and came to stand beside them and asked her what she saw. She told him it was specific and considered and entirely her own reading. The artist looked at Min-ho and said, "Your friend is seeing this correctly," and Min-ho said, "Yes, she usually does." Afterward, walking by the river, she said she had not been to something like that in a long time, that there were parts of herself she had put away during the survival years, the parts that did not serve the immediate purpose of keeping herself fed and housed and functional. He said he wanted to know those parts. He said he wanted to know all the parts she had put away. She was quiet for a moment. The river moved beside them, Seoul lights reflected in it in long broken lines. She said that was a considerable thing to want. He said he was a person with considerable wants. She laughed, and the sound of it moved through him in a way that he thought he might spend a great deal of the rest of his life hopping to cause. He stopped walking. She turned to look at him and found him looking at her with that expression, the one he used when he had decided something completely and was simply waiting for the right moment to say it. He said her name. She said what? He said he was in love with her and he wanted her to know that because it was true and because he did not have any interest in managing it or waiting for a strategically optimal moment to say it. He said he had been in love with her for some time and was not entirely sure when it had started, but was entirely sure it was not stopping. The river moved, the lights reflected. Blessing stood looking at him and felt the thing in her chest that she had been carefully managing since the day he had said he had not been able to stop thinking about her since the first day, and she felt it move past managing and past careful and into something clear and unmistakable. She said, for her part, that she had been in love with him since the afternoon in the courtyard on the 9th floor when he had brought her lunch, and she had known, the way you sometimes simply know things, that this was something. He came to her in the small space between words and kissed her with the exact combination of gentleness and certainty that she had, without consciously forming the thought, been waiting for. The city was around them, and it was not paying attention to them, and they were not paying attention to it. And time did the thing it does in moments like that, which is to both stop and expand simultaneously. When they parted, she pressed her forehead briefly against his and breathed, and he did the same, and nothing needed to be said. Winter came, and with it, the particular quality of soul in cold months, the city pulling inward and bright. Blessing moved into the apartment on the building's 22nd floor, which Min-ho had been renovating quietly for 3 months on the principle of hopping, not assuming, and which she had strong opinions about the kitchen layout of, that he incorporated without debate, because she was right, and the kitchen was important. She did not leave her job at the Hansung Grand. Min-ho had offered, she had considered, she had decided that she wanted to keep working, at least for now, but on her own terms, in a role that used her organizational abilities more fully, a transition she negotiated herself with director Yoon without Min-ho in the room. She was now part of the operations improvement team, assessing guest experience and staff efficiency, which meant she moved through the hotel with authority and with a clipboard, and with the deep satisfaction of someone who has turned their experience of a place into a tool for improving it. The staff who had known her before treated her with a respect that had nothing to do with her connection to the owner of the building. It had been earned, they knew it, and she knew it, and that distinction was the most important thing. His aunt came to dinner at the 22nd floor apartment in December, looked around at the kitchen and the plants Blessing had introduced, and the particular way the space felt inhabited and alive in ways it had not before, and said over the main course that she had been worried about Min-ho for a long time, the particular worry of loving someone who has made themselves very efficient and very successful and very alone, and that she was no longer worried. Min-ho, across the table, said she should not have admitted that where he could hear her. His aunt said she said what she meant, and he had apparently been learning that from someone. Blessing laughed. His aunt looked at her with the warmth of someone who has found the right person for a person they love. On an evening in January, with snow outside and the apartment warm and the kind of quiet that is full rather than empty, Min-ho sat beside Blessing on the couch where she was reading, and he had something in his hand. She looked up. He was looking at her with that expression, the complete one. He said he had been thinking about what a life looked like when it was built around the right things rather than around the absence of the wrong ones. He said he had spent a long time building correctly and completely and in every direction except the one that actually required someone else to build with. He said she was the person he wanted to build with. He opened the small box. She looked at it, she looked at him. She said slowly that she was a hotel operations analyst from Lagos who had spent 4 years being invisible in Seoul and had met him because a locker key didn't work. He said yes. He said none of that was a coincidence in any way that mattered. He said that everything had led to that corridor and to her looking at Mrs. O with that burning composure, and to him standing there understanding, for the first time in years, what he wanted his life to contain. She felt her eyes fill. She was not a person who cried easily, and she did not cry now, but it was close. She said yes. She said it the same way she said all the things she meant, simply and completely, and he put the ring on her finger, and she looked at it for a moment, and then she looked at him, and there was nothing complicated about what she felt. It was large and certain and entirely hers. They were married in April, a ceremony that was small because both of them had learned the difference between significant and large, in a garden space that Blessing had chosen because it had good light and Min-ho had agreed because she was right about light, as she was right about a great many things. Sung-woo made a speech that was formal and also unexpectedly moving. His aunt held it together until the end of the speech and then did not. Chisholm flew in from London, where she had moved for work, and wore the most celebratory dress in the venue, and cried the most of anyone, and was proud of both things. Blessing's mother, who had been told the full truth over a series of Sunday phone calls conducted over the winter with increasing detail, and then with a video call where she met Min-ho and looked at him through the screen for a long time before saying that he had good manners, which in her vocabulary was the highest praise she gave people she had not yet fed. was present via video with Blessing's two sisters, and the collective noise they made when the ceremony was completed was audible to the entire garden. In September of the following year, Blessing sat in the kitchen of the apartment, which had the exact layout she had argued for, in the particular morning light that she had been right about, with a cup of tea and a feeling she had been sitting with for 2 weeks waiting until she was sure. She was sure. Min-ho was at the table with his phone and his coffee and the particular focused stillness he had in the morning before the day started. She said his name. He looked up, and she told him. She watched his expression move through something she could not entirely categorize because it was too many things at once, and then it settled into something so clear and unguarded that she realized she was seeing his face without any of the careful layers, just him, just what this meant to him. He came around the table and sat beside her and held both her hands and looked at her like she was everything worth protecting in the world, which she had long since stopped being surprised by but which still moved through her every time like something new. Outside, Seoul moved through its morning, the city going about its business, the streets and the noise and the ordinary extraordinary rhythm of a place that did not stop for individual moments. Inside the kitchen, with the right light and the right layout and the tea that was exactly right, the two of them sat with the knowledge of the life ahead of them, built from an accidental locker key and a delivery uniform, and the particular courage of being seen by someone who was actually looking. It was not a small thing. It was, in fact, everything.